Kia ora, and welcome to the Niggly Niche Cast. It's your bully, the Diggity Doodah Dog, Mr. Peptide Panther, Mr. Slippers here, coming to you direct up the guts from day one of the Aotearoa lockdown thingy that we are all going through at the moment. And I can tell you, the sun is in the sky, the clouds are in the sky, as they are every single day. The trees are still around, the birds are still around, and the world keeps spinning. We still had nighttime, we still have daytime, everyone's alive, kinda, and we keep on moving forward. Wobbly wildcard, kia ora. What is crack-a-lackin' to you?
Not a whole lot there, Doc. You want to know how I started off my day one of lockdown? Was I set myself the goal last night. I said I'm going to get up bright and early, right at sunset, going to get out to the garage, going to churn out a full-on workout, have a perfect old start to lockdown, and as it happens, forgot to set the old alarm, slept in through past 9 o'clock, and might have to push that one through till later on. Not the ideal way to start off my lockdown, but I don't know, lesson learned, I'll get around to it.
The beauty is, wildcard, that you can do whatever you want. We're still in this world where you've got another opportunity tomorrow, so if you want to wake up, if you have an actual desire to wake up early and start your day in that fashion, it's up to you. Everyone's got that choice how they operate and how they spend their days of this period. It's just a case of whatever you want to do, that's what you can do, and it's a beautiful thing.
It is a beautiful thing. I did still get my cold shower in this morning, so it wasn't a complete waste.
Even if you didn't have your cold shower, you've got another opportunity to battle on today. So I think in these times, no morning is a waste, because no matter how crazy it seems, you still just wake up and you're still in existence. You're still there. You got another day. It's just battle through it, and there's no such thing as a waste at all. So.
Yeah, well, there's a line in the movie Scarface which I've heard Stephen Adams repeat in interviews before, which is "Any day above ground is a good day." So it's a little bit of a somber saying, but there's some positive truth behind it, I suppose.
What have you been writing about over the last few days, Senior Wildcard, on the niche case? We're doing a lot of maybe just things that we've always really wanted to write about, but we haven't had time. So it's a beautiful time for us to churn out different bits and pieces of content. So what's been on your plate over this week, really?
Yeah, I'll tell you what, it's been a lot of football stuff. I've been trying to because this is the sort of thing I wouldn't otherwise get the chance to do, because I'd be one thing onto the next, and then there's, everything's happening at once, got to keep churning along. Here we've actually got the rare gift of radio silence, and I have time to actually dig into some of these things. So I'm writing team by team kind of reviews from the local premiership footy season. So I did Auckland City in their championship as it happens campaign. I did that one in the write up which also was the write up about how the league had been called off as it was, and I did a team Wellington and Eastern Suburbs one, the two finalists from last year. Then I've done one which combined the other three teams from the North Island, excluding the Wellington Phoenix, because I think the Phoenix can have their own little one, because there's just a different perspective from them in terms of how they link in with the senior team. The next one, so that'll happen at some point. The next one is the three South Island teams as well. Hopefully get that done today or tomorrow. Also wrote yesterday about the Wellington Phoenix, and just sort of celebrating a lot of the good things that have come about this season, because they were, as it happens, they're sitting third on the table. They're 3 points, not 3 points, they're 4 points behind Melbourne City with 3 games in hand, which means that if they do ever get to pick up the season and complete all their games, they're a bloody good chance to finish second. And even if they don't, a third place finish is already the best finish that the Phoenix have ever had in a regular season. They tend not to be much of a regular season team, to be fair. So I just wanted to write something that sort of celebrates how well they've done this season, in case they don't get like the opportunity to turn that into a big playoff run. If this is just, which it very well might be, if like this is the last they get to play this season, then yeah, I think they just deserved a bit of a spotlight on some of those things. That's what I have written. A few things I've been thinking of getting around to. I'm writing a thing of just some like movies about isolation and illness and things like that, which are completely inappropriate. Recommendations for people who want to get crazy with that. The albums of the month thing is probably something I've got to get a couple more churned out over the next couple of days. And then also I watched last night, just like last day before quarantine, last day of level 3, I watched I thought it was just going to be the highlights. I was hoping it was going to be a full replay. It was a sort of like little documentary highlights / thing that Sky Sports put together about Nathan Astor's 222, and mate, I had some significant thoughts about that one. So we might come to that later on in the podcast as well. Might bounce a couple ideas off you before I write about them, but I'll throw it back to you as well, like what you've been working on, because I've quite enjoyed your City Kickboxing analysis as well that's been coming out bit by bit. So there's that. What else you got working on?
Well, that's all I've been working on the last 3 days, started with the Lineage, which is the Aotearoa's history that has led us to this point. Not super duper deep history, but just how the people involved at City Kickboxing are part of the long line of combat sports excellence from Aotearoa, and then that flowed into the style of how City Kickboxing fighters operate, which that offered a little nugget that I found very interesting in writing about it, was how all of Aotearoa's like combat sports history is striking. It's boxing and it's kickboxing. We don't have a wrestling culture. We don't really. Jiu-jitsu is very trendy, become very trendy over the last 10 years. So there is a jiu-jitsu presence in Aotearoa, but between there's no like high school wrestling scene in New Zealand, for example, and you're only going to have like people who seek out jiu-jitsu training. That's the only real people who are involved in jiu-jitsu. So I was writing about the general City Kickboxing style, which is world-class striking and effective defensive grappling. And that defensive grappling is world-class, but City Kickboxing have done that without any grappling culture in New Zealand. So there's no wrestling culture in New Zealand, but they still have some high-quality wrestling coaches who have played a key role in that style of City Kickboxing. And then today I wrote about the culture, and the culture of City Kickboxing, which has all the hallmarks of fascinating culture. I think at some stage I'll become like a team culture aficionado, because I've just absorbed so much content on building a team culture and establishing a team culture and understanding the nuances of team culture and all the hallmarks of standard excellent team culture are present with City Kickboxing. But that led me to like how people throw off team culture and culture as a cliche and something that isn't real, when it's the exact opposite. Like everything in a team comes from the team culture, and I'd strongly suggest that people who don't understand culture or don't see culture or don't feel culture, they may be the people who, as I wrote today, if you establishing a culture of excellence and a family-based successful culture and everything that City Kickboxing has done, it takes a lot of work. So some people, it's too hard for them to sacrifice so much for the team instead of over the individual. It's too hard for them to give up their Sundays to help their teammates perform. It's too hard for them to stick to their morals and values in the face of temptation or adversity. It's too hard for them to show up every day over a 10-year period. It's too hard for them to, in the All Blacks case, clean the changing room. It's too hard for them to grab the bags off the bus and help. Like, people who don't understand culture are probably the people who find it too difficult to help establish a team culture. And the easiest way that I've found to think of culture is actually culture. So on the one hand, you've got a team culture in a sports team, a work team, an organization. And then you've got this other culture, which is the bacterial culture that gives yogurt, that gives us bread and kombucha. And when you think of how that culture becomes yogurt, like, you've got your culture that you can, that you hold on to, but you can make that culture into yogurt, and then you can keep that culture, and that culture becomes the basis of any, if you're using it for bread, it becomes the basis of your bread products. If you're using it for yogurt, it becomes the basis of your dairy products. That's team culture. Team culture is that living organism that you nourish and you nurture and you develop over time, that then becomes the yogurt, which in this context of City Kickboxing, you've got the bacterial culture, which is the feeling, the vibe, the atmosphere, the nuances of the culture in City Kickboxing, and then the yogurt, the end product, is what are the fighters who compete. And I think for anyone who doesn't understand culture, you only need to understand bacterial culture and what goes into making bread and yogurt to understand how team culture operates.
I love that. I love that analogy there. You got my head spinning a little bit trying to think about that. And the whole City Kickboxing thing is such a fascinating story, because this sort of is going to cross over us into some of that territory. I was thinking about the Black Caps and Nathan Astle and all that, but with City Kickboxing, it's, on the one hand, you got these very sort of Kiwi, it is a pretty person-to-person, ground-level type organization. No one's got their head in the clouds kind of thing, which is obviously the basis probably of that group culture thing there. They've also, they're based in Auckland. They're not out in LA or anything or wherever. They're very much I guess you'd have to say the underdogs, and they're overachievers as the underdogs, but it's not like you see with a lot of, and the Black Caps most of all. I keep teasing this Black Caps thing, but we'll come back to that. Because City Kickboxing isn't just they're not just going over there to the big wide world and all these different fighters just competing above their sort of expectations. They're actually going out there and winning, and in some cases winning championship bouts. It's not just overachieving, it's straight up dominating, and from a perspective of this is what you can achieve, regardless of the fact that you're based all the way, down in the bottom of the world, comparatively speaking, to where a lot of the power structures in the UFC are, and things and such. You can compete on that exact same level with fewer resources with these other things if you've got everything in line and working together, and everything's sort of you think of the cogs in a machine, where if one of them's out of sync, the whole thing isn't going to work. But if everything is in the exact same place where everything needs to be, the wheels of the train or whatever are going to keep rolling, and there's only one direction it can go in,
Yes, although I wouldn't really associate the word underdog with City Kickboxing. There's nothing underdoggy about them.
Definitely not anymore.
Well, ever. It's just the only underdog factor is that you're from New Zealand, and that was mostly what I was thinking. The reason I don't associate being an underdog with City Kickboxing is because I don't even think being from New Zealand makes you an underdog. It's, if you are maybe, the Black Caps are underdogs because they lack the resources and financial resources and general resources that the other countries have. So every time the Black Caps go out, they are the underdogs compared to the bigger nations in the cricketing world because it's not a even playing field. But in most sports that don't have such disparity in resource, like fighting is just what you're doing in the gym. It doesn't matter what resources you have. It doesn't matter what kind of punching bags you have. It doesn't matter what kind of treadmills you have. Sure, maybe your gym might have some cryotherapy, some hot cold stuff, and you might just have greater technology and all that, but in the sense of fighting, it's just like what's your training? Who are your coaches? And City Kickboxing have the best coaches in the world. They have a team culture that you could argue is among the best in like UFC team in the world. So it's just there's nothing really underdoggy about them, and you could say underdoggy because they had one guy in the UFC who was coming up, and it's just more of a time thing. But yeah, I just don't really associate, even as Israel Adesanya, as he was just coming into the UFC, he wasn't an underdog. He came into the UFC with hype. He came into the UFC with buzz, and there was a clear line of what was going to happen from Israel Adesanya entering the UFC to winning a title belt. He was, to any tapped in UFC fan, Israel Adesanya was the guy to watch. And so it's just I don't know if at any stage City Kickboxing have been underdoggy other than being from New Zealand, but in this case, being from New Zealand, because we know, as I've explained, New Zealand has a fantastic combat sports history. So being from New Zealand is a great thing, because there's no real, you mentioned power structures, there's no real power structure in the UFC. It just if you're great, you're going to be great. It doesn't matter where you're from, what you're doing. Other than maybe being close to Las Vegas, where the UFC have this whole performance institute that any fighter on the UFC roster can use. So maybe if you're close to Las Vegas, you're going to have access to that, and so on and so forth. But in this case, I believe coming from New Zealand is fantastic because of the excellence in combat sports that comes from New Zealand. And KG for KG, New Zealand's the best sporting nation in the world. KG for KG, New Zealand is the best creative nation in the world. And KG for KG, New Zealand has the greatest fighting knowledge in the world as well. So all of that is it is what it is, and that's led City Kickboxing to this point of being one of the best teams in the world.
Yeah, I guess that centralized sort of UFC structure does help, because it means no one's being left behind unfairly, which is certainly what happens in boxing. Because I think all the fights that Joseph Parker was having in New Zealand, you kept there was always that feeling like he's being held back a little bit by fighting here, like he needs to go to where the action is, kind of thing. And I suppose that's probably not anywhere near as much of a factor in UFC. But I still even just taking that back, it's how does the best coaches in the world, well, Eugene Behrman or whatever, without doubt one of the finest coaches in this sport, if not the finest coach in the sport right now, given what's being achieved. But how even that, how does that happen? How does someone like him get to be at such a level? Comparatively to everyone else in his, because the resource thing still has to be a factor, surely, if the proximity thing doesn't have to be. But I guess they've just found ways to either, I mean, you already said the thing about the gym equipment is just gym equipment. The shinier it is doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be using it better or more effectively. So I don't know. It still just seems a bit baffling that they've been. But I guess it's not. I suppose that's what the whole story is that if you don't cut corners and if you get everything right, you're going to be competing on that level, because that's, if everything's aligned, then you've got it sorted, I suppose.
So why is what makes Eugene Behrman an excellent coach? What makes Ronaldo? It's just excellence. It's just you either have the genes and the DNA for excellence in your field, or you don't. It does it like that's within you. That's not an external thing. But then it's not just Eugene Behrman. It's all these other coaches that are involved as well. It's all these other coaches who are from the lineage of Aotearoa's combat sports history. All these coaches involved come from the line of fighting history in Aotearoa. So there's 4, 5, 6 coaches who have all competed in kickboxing, who have competed in boxing and fighting of different arts as well. And so it starts with that, and then it's the 10 years of showing up every day and establishing the culture, because the culture is what breeds the excellence. The culture breeds the attitude in your gym. The culture breeds the showing up 7 days and showing up on a Sunday to help your teammate train even though you don't have a fight. These are the things that are within the walls of City Kickboxing that they do that has taken them to this level, and that's just all culture. The fact that all the City Kickboxing fighters show up, they train to help their teammates, and you are expected, whether you're Israel Adesanya, whether you're Dan Hooker, whoever you are. Adesanya is a superstar of the sport. After Israel Adesanya fights, he might have a week off, and then he's back at the gym to help his teammates train. These are the attitudes that make the best in the world, and with culture fresh on my mind from writing today, culture doesn't cost any money. Culture doesn't matter where you are in the world. It's up to you as individuals and team to manifest the culture, and as long as you have that little fermenting piece of bacteria in your team and your organization, you can do anything. So it's a case of what the people involved with City Kickboxing have done consistently every day over a long period of time. That's what makes them excellent. It's not where they are in the world. It's not the fact that they're from little old New Zealand. It's not the fact that they have this equipment over that equipment. No, it's that bacteria. It's that culture that they have breeding and festering inside their gym, inside their environment, their family environment. Everyone rallies and supports each other, sacrifices for each other. Whereas if you go to any boxing gym and many other MMA gyms, the best fighters are not going to show up to help their teammates train. The best fighters are definitely not going to be intimidated by their coaches. And I don't think the City Kickboxing fighters are scared or intimidated by the coaches, but I've heard many examples now of how quickly and easily the elders of City Kickboxing can put anyone in line, whether it's the elders or whether it's their fellow fighters. No one gets too big for the gym, and straight up, like Eugene Behrman or Doug Viney or any other coaches, they'll fuck anyone up who thinks that they are getting too big. And that's just culture. That's, again, what are you doing every day? What are you doing inside your gym every day with the people around you? That's what gets you to a point of excellence. It's not it is resources and other examples, but in this, as long as you have that culture within your walls, anything's possible. And especially when you have technical brilliance and you have those other boxes ticked as well.
I think there's a pretty interesting parallel here with the Ole Football Academy as well, because, I mean, football is the most popular, most competitive, most crowded sport on the planet. So, like, compared to other academies overseas, like, obviously Ole don't have anywhere near the sort of parallel success of City Kickboxing, where you got, like, Israel Adesanya, world champion sort of thing. It's not like, it's not like there's going to be $100 million transfers for someone who came through Ole at any point. But comparatively speaking, for the rest of the country, you look at the recent under-17s team from last year, absolutely dominated by players from two places. Pretty overwhelmingly, guys coming out of the Phoenix Academy and guys coming out of Ole Academy. You expect that from the Phoenix Academy. They've got, they certainly had links up in Auckland. They're a little less so at the moment. but also that's a professional setup with a pipeline all the way to a professional club at the top, and they've put a lot of money into their thing. It's sort of, that's a Phoenix financial situation probably isn't anywhere near what other football clubs around the world are. Even in the A-League, they're probably struggling. We always had that metric thing, but it's still like, it's the only professional club in the country. You expect a level of that, but Ole Academy is a independently run, school based in Pororua, and like, how have they produced so many players of all through the age group things, and now at this point in time, we've also seen them like they're going to have a massive contribution in every All-White squad for the next 10, 15 years, perhaps perpetually onwards after that, like from this point on. Guys like Ryan Thomas and Callum McCoward and Elijah Just and Nando Pinecker, etc., 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 all these dudes coming through, and they're all excellent footballers, and they play in a different style to the rest of the country as well, because they're trained to be like more technical, more quick moving, quick passes, a little more of perhaps more of a modern style, but maybe more of a well-rounded style as well, whereas a lot of other players will have like big strengths and big weaknesses sort of thing. You think of the typical Kiwi, like hard tackling defender, but rubbish with the ball at their feet sort of thing. That's not the kind of player you'd get coming through Ole. And I think a lot of that, you get a very, some of this is just because Declan Edge is running the show, and Declan Edge is a fella who likes to think of himself as a revolutionary, and for good reason, because I think he genuinely has done a lot of revolutionary things. But like, even withdrawn from that, I think the entire academy structure has a lot of, how would you say, like, I guess that same kind of festering bacteria, let's say. Like, there's a lot of emphasis on discipline and buying into the team thing, and everyone over the individual sort of thing, and you've got a lot of team building and thoughts like that. You see those guys hanging pretty tight. They're all good mates, come up through. They live at the academy as well when you get to a certain stage. So it's very much an immersive kind of atmosphere as well. And I hear a lot of stories about them also pushing boundaries with innovations and stuff like that, which I guess you have to in terms of being able to cut the corners when, because for them, it's not just about looking at how are we producing all whites, because that's not really what they're thinking. The all white thing happens by itself as a happy sort of side consequence. What they're looking to do is create professional footballers, which means they're looking to judge themselves against how clubs in Europe are doing things, basically. And how do you do that? Well, those clubs, if you look at Sarpreet Singh at Bayern Munich or something like that, the resources he must have to work with. Obviously, Ole's got to cut a lot of corners to do that. So they are seemingly pretty like at the sort of cutting edge of a lot of ideas with sports science and things like that, which is quite interesting and quite exciting to read about, actually, when I hear things like that, because you often do get like, I don't know, it's trendy, but it's trendy for a reason, because a lot of those things work and they are different to how other people are doing things. So if you're just going to follow the way everything else has always been done, you're not really going to achieve anything, because you're just going to be following behind rather than running out in front. Would you say City Kickboxing are innovative in that kind of way as well? I'm not sure. I mean, you're the one to ask. I'm not going to throw out an opinion on the matter because I don't know. But would you say they're a sort of innovative organization as well?
They're innovative in the sense that they have the best striking in the world, and they're ahead of the curve in striking. I imagine like Ole is innovative in a similar sense, in the sense that they are doing things that diverge from the norm of how Kiwi football players of the junior levels are developed and are coached. I actually think they're exactly the same, City Kickboxing and Ole, because it depends on what your objective is. I imagine City Kickboxing's objective with the UFC is, and their professionals, is to develop UFC champions. Ole is trying to develop professional footballers. So you started that by comparing, like, maybe they're not at the same levels and stuff like that. They're at the exact same level because they're achieving their objectives, and that's all that matters. Like, it doesn't, when you're dealing with these sorts of cultures, especially in New Zealand, where we have, like, our sporting team cultures are deeply rooted in humility and teamwork and those kind of ideals, it doesn't matter, like, the glitz and the glam doesn't matter. It's just whether you are achieving your objective. So Ole continues to churn out professional footballers, and that's what matters, because that's their intention, that's their objective. And so important to culture is knowing who you are and what's your DNA. What's the DNA goes back to the festering bacteria that you have living in your walls. That's your DNA. That's who you are. That's the culture that you've tried to develop. And you, throughout that process, you have to stick to your DNA. That's how you compound your culture. Like, your culture just gets stronger and stronger and stronger when you stick to your DNA as to who you are. And that goes back to, what are your objectives? Are your objectives to become a multi-million-dollar organization? Are your objectives to open your doors to everyone and anyone and put your financials first, put the headlines first, put the popularity first? Or is your DNA connected to producing UFC champions and producing professional footballers, which is what they both do? And I would imagine both City Kickboxing and Ole will always have that as their main objective. And you can break it down. So, like, to be a professional footballer, you have to have certain aspects of your personality, and, like, there's offshoots to that. But ultimately, what Ole is trying to do is produce professional footballers, and what City Kickboxing is trying to do is produce UFC champions. The innovation is there. The innovation definitely is there, but it's there in the skills. A lot of the other things are just so simple. So simple. It's just showing up every day and executing those skills. Like, Ole doesn't have the same resources as the Manchester United Academy or any other team in Europe, those academies. They've probably barely got the resources of some of the South American academies or the academies in Australia. Doesn't matter. You're still on the field with the ball. So what are you doing when you're on the field with the ball? How are you training? What intensity are you training with? What kind of drills are you doing? What's the atmosphere of your trainings? Are people there showing up for an 8 p.m. training? They show up at 7:55. They sit there, they chat, they sit on their phones, and by 10 past 8, everyone gets together on the training paddock and starts their training. Is that your attitude? Or is your attitude show up at 7:45, do your warm-ups so that you hit the field at 8 p.m. and you're ready to go? None of those things involve resources. None of those things involve drastic innovation. It's just it's your attitude towards developing skill and what you're doing on the field. And it's really that simple. Like, a lot of people might want to overcomplicate culture. They might want to overcomplicate what it takes to be the best. It just comes down to, like, are you willing to buy into that team's culture and how they operate, which you'd be a fool not to. Like, if you go to Ole and you're not engaged with that culture, what's the point of being there? Same with City Kickboxing. So are you willing to dive into that? And it's just like, what are you doing on the field with the ball? And what's your attitude to the training? What's your attitude to working together? All those things are so simple, and they involve the least resources, but the ability to do it consistently over a long period of time, with discipline, with a positive, vibrant attitude, that's the difference. Because for many, it's just too hard. It's just too hard for people to put the team first. It's too hard for people to put the organization first. It's too hard for them to release their own selfish needs. It's too hard for them to sacrifice for someone else's success. It's too hard to sit for 5 years, 10 years and do the same thing over and over again to lay that platform. Like, I don't know when Ole was founded, but they wouldn't have had, instant success stories. Their success stories and their professional footballers that they would have hoped to develop would have come 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years into their into what they were doing. And it's just like, for me, it's really that simple. It's just that people, and from those people, organizations, they're just not willing to do it. They're not willing to. The shortcuts are too easy, and they take the easier options when the key to establishing a culture is all the work that you put into establishing that culture and the people that you have involved in establishing that culture.
And that stuff is free. Like, it's not just it's not just that the difference in resources is like the resource gap is shrunk by those things. It's like, no, this is free, and it's a baseline for anyone too. Because you'd probably, I'm guessing, find the exact same thing if you did go to the Manchester United Academy or the Manchester City Academy or any of those Premier League academies. They're all on enormous dollars anyway. So, like, if you looked at any of them, the guys who cut the corners and don't have the right attitude are the guys who fall by the wayside, no matter how, I can think of a few, like Ravel Morrison, as a Man United fan, springs to mind of someone who just, was in the same team as, he's one of those, hard luck stories that everyone that gets churned out a little bit now and then. He was in, the same youth teams coming through as, Paul Pogba, Jesse Lingard, those guys, and everyone said this guy is the most talented, most naturally talented player we've had at this club in the youth team since Ryan Giggs or whatever. And he just went nowhere because he had a terrible attitude. And I mean, he played a lot of professional football. He played Premier League with other teams. He played in Italy for a while, but he just bounced from club to club to club because everyone saw the natural talent and no one got the buy-in from him. So, and I mean, that's just one famous case. There's been thousands more of players who dropped out of academies when they were younger than that, when they were 13, 14, 15, 16, at a point where you got to really start taking it seriously, especially at that sort of 15, 16 age, and you're starting to see your mates pushing up into higher teams and stuff, and maybe you're not, and maybe you just lose interest a bit. Those are if you don't that's it. At every level, that's a necessity in order to push things forward. Some more than others, I suppose, especially when natural talent comes into the mix. People, a lot of coaches will cut corners for players who are a little bit better, but that's again a difference which I'm not sure you certainly wouldn't see that at City Kickboxing. Don't think you'd see that at Ole. I don't think you'd see that in the most successful things as well. So, I don't know. Lots of different little aspects to this whole thing. It's pretty interesting. Side note as well, when you're talking about DNA, it reminded me of a completely off-topic, weird story, but when I go running sometimes, the Kendrick Lamar song, DNA, I get that stuck in my head at a certain point all the time while I'm running when I, try to pick up my stride and run a little bit faster, and I think it's because I must, my steps must be in tune with the rhythm of that song. For whatever reason, that song pops into my head, almost visually as well, quite vibrantly, just pops into my head when I hit a certain, stride while I'm running, which is just a weird story that I threw out there because it reminded me of that.
A little bit of that DNA DMT entering your loins.
That must be it.
Going back to the individual with culture, culture, when I'm thinking and talking about culture, the only individual aspect involves the people who lead the culture and establish the culture. From that point, the individual, so people coming, players coming into the Ole Academy, fighters coming into City Kickboxing, they don't matter. Because if you're, it's completely up to that individual. It doesn't matter. It's whether you're going to fit into this culture or not. Where you have issues is where you make exceptions for people who are obviously not fitting into your culture, but you keep them around because they're going to bring in more money, or you keep them around because they might offer this or offer that, but that's what eats away at your culture. So the individual, other than the people who establish the culture, other than the people who lead the culture every day, the individual doesn't matter. Does it? For people who can't buy into a culture or whatever, it's like I don't care. And I think that's the attitude. Like, of course, you got empathy. Oh, like, it's really nice that you came, and unfortunately, it's just not working out. Like, you got to have some sort of sympathy and empathy. But at the end of the day, it's completely your choice. It's your choice. What you do in a day. You've got complete ownership of your own actions and your own beliefs. And if you don't want to, or if you're not willing to operate within a team's culture, then fuck you. It doesn't the team doesn't stop for you. The culture doesn't stop for you. The nothing revolves around you, so you just drift away. And that's I think that's where a lot of maybe organizations and teams miss out on reaching that level of culture, is they make exceptions for people who are not adding to the culture, and then that develops into the disintegration of your desired culture. What Black Caps thoughts did you have from your little Nathan Astle fantasy?
Yeah, Black Caps, right. Well, actually, first of all, I'll just throw out this thing. I'm trying to, there was a book that I heard, the guy who wrote it went on Zach Lowe's podcast. It would have been a year or two ago, and he'd written a book about what it takes to win, and how to find, just looking at teams, champion teams and stuff. It was an American dude. I can't remember what his name was, and I can't remember what the book was called, but it lingered in my head sometimes. I was trying to figure out what it was. I'll have a look, I'll see if I can find it. But the dude went into different, the Manchester United teams under Ferguson. The All Blacks was one of the teams he looked at. The Golden State Warriors, they were winning, and also some of those, other NBA teams. Various different examples of teams that won a lot. And the thing he found, the draw line through everything, was that they all had a sort of hierarchy of leadership within the team, which was all every single one of those teams had a guy a Draymond Green, a Roy Keane, that type of player, someone who was at the top, who led the culture, who demanded a certain level from everyone else below them. So I don't know, that was something. I want to read that book. I don't know what the book was. I'm going to have to look it up and find it. But anyway, on Nathan Astle, I could probably go all day on this, but I won't, because we shouldn't take forever on the podcast. But to me, that was a very formative performance. As a fan of the Black Caps, that Nathan Astle 222, I remember so much about that day and how I watched it. And I remember I was out for a while at my grandparents' home, and Dad and I were rushing back, listening on the radio. Cut the corner, went to my I think we went to my aunt's place to catch the end of the game there, so that we could because it was going to be quicker than getting home. We just don't want to miss as much of this innings as possible, sort of thing. And I mean, I was at an age where it was coming to grips with the team and the personalities and the thing, sort of thing, becoming a fan, basically. So it was kind of a formative time for me, I think, that innings. And I think I was thinking about this, watching this, about the other different formative times through the year, the most definitive, because I had a theory at first watching that, this is borderline the most definitive moment in New Zealand cricket, and I have a theory of why. Just because, it was absolutely intense, thrilling, incredible. It was a massive underdog story as well, fitting with the Black Caps, we're talking about them earlier, because it was Nathan Astle up against the world. England were cruising to victory, and then he's just pummeling sixes, lifting them onto the stand, onto the roof at Jade Stadium, RIP. And ultimately broke a world record in the process, which still hasn't been broken since, which is just the most incredible thing. But ultimately we lost that game, and we lost it pretty comfortably by 98 runs or something like that. One of the most incredible, beloved moments in New Zealand cricket history, we still lost. And I was thinking, and I threw that question at my dad, and he said, that's not the most definitive moment in New Zealand cricket. The underarm ball was. And I said, well, what happened with the underarm ball? We still lost that one too, didn't we? And like, what about Bert Sutcliffe that time? He came out with a bandage around his head to bat with Bob Blair, try to save a test match in South Africa after Bob Blair's fiancée had been killed in the Tangiwai disaster, like the famous one there. And Bert Sutcliffe again bashing sixes. I think he scored a 50 or something, something like that. They just had a big old swing and tried to save the test. Again, we lost. We didn't win. Then my brother threw out, well, what about Grant Elliott's 6 at Eden Park? So, yeah, well, that was a pretty fantastic one in a winning effort. What happened next? Well, we got smashed in the final. Like, it wasn't even close. And then I think, well, actually, my theory, now that I remember, my theory wasn't that Nathan Aspinall thing was the definitive one. It was that it was the definitive one up until the World Cup final last year, which, again, like, incredible game. A lot of English people tell you the greatest game of cricket ever played. What happened at the end of it? We didn't win. I'm not going to say we lost, but we certainly didn't win. And it just seems to be this little recurring theme with the Black Caps, which is why that World Cup final was even more devastating, because it was an opportunity to break what had been a real chain of just like the Black Caps being lovable underdog battlers, everyone's second favorite team, like the kind of team that goes out there, does that plays cricket in the right way. Everyone loves to watch them, but they don't win when it matters. And yeah, it just seems to be a bit of a through line throughout the entire history. Even if you look at like, I suppose you can find more positive, like historical moments in the Black Caps of, say, Richard Hadley leading them to victory in Australia, like I think he took 9 for in one of those games, and like that's the reason that was so famous is because we never beat Australia otherwise. The reason our first test victory was such a big deal is because it had taken like 30 years or something. First test win at Lord's, first series victory in England, I think they were the same thing. Again, like great, because we had such a history of losing to those like teams beforehand. So I don't know, it just seems to be a bit of a theme with the Black Caps going back through the entire history of international cricket involving New Zealand. So I don't know if you got any thoughts on that matter or not.
Yeah, definitely not the right person, because funnily enough, my historical knowledge is terrible, and I don't really, I've got no idea what the fuck I was doing when Nathan Aspinall hit that 222, let alone all the other things. I was going to say maybe the Black Caps have not a losing culture, but they've prioritized certain cultural elements over a successful winning culture. But it goes back to that idea of the underdog. The Black Caps are legitimate underdogs kind of by circumstance, as we've kind of explored, and unfortunately, they are the prototypical underdog, because everyone loves the underdog. Sometimes the underdog wins, but the underdog is an underdog for a reason, and that's because they oftentimes do not win. So I think it's just more of a case of the Black Caps just being glorious underdogs, and it's just, yeah, I don't know.
I mean, that is what it is. Like, that's completely true. And they are legitimate underdogs for reasons beyond their control as well. But, yeah, that's why it would be nice if we could have nice things every now and then. But, I don't know. It seems after that World Cup final, it just seems like maybe this is... Are they cursed? Probably not, but maybe.
It's kind of like the Warriors. Like, the Warriors are just a losing team. It's just what they've done for the bulk of their existence is bathe in a certain level of mediocrity, and it kind of just goes back to your DNA. Like, what's your DNA as a team? What's your DNA as an organization? And for like my knowledge and history of the Black Caps is sporadic moments of amazing cricket. Like, I do actually remember listening on the radio when I think it was that VB series when they were in Australia way back in the day, and they were...
Oh, yeah, Shane Bond.
I think they won a game or whatever, and I remember being up late at night listening to it on the radio, but that's the same as the Warriors. There were moments when the Warriors won the minor premiership. The Warriors have made it to grand finals and all that, but ultimately they are both losing kind of teams. Like, yes, it's fantastic that they have both made it to certain points of different journeys. Like, the Black Caps have made finals and semi-finals of World Cups consistently, and that's good. The Warriors have made it to grand finals, but ultimately they do not win, which is what you're alluding to. Like, they just can't get over the hump, and that's the, like it or not, that's the DNA of those teams, of those organizations. And until you get over that hump of legitimately winning and winning at a high level, because winning breeds winning. So when you get a taste of that winning, then you can start to develop your culture around that winning, and your DNA shifts towards a more winning kind of DNA.
It must just be the hardest thing in the world to overturn that, though. Like, once it becomes a part of the furniture almost in a club or a team, like to change that narrative, to somehow turn the Warriors into a winning team. I mean, I don't really know how you do it. There's ways of because once it becomes a thing, there's almost like an excuse, like, oh, this is just who we are. Like, there's just that little, it might only be 1% of a difference, but like when the other team 100% thinks they're destined to win and you're only 99% thinking you're destined to win, you're probably not going to win. Like, that, those 1%ers really do add up at the absolute peak of a competition, of a sport. Like, that's where you find the difference. So the team who turns up just happy to be there versus the team who turns up there like knowing that they won't be able to sleep for a month if they don't win this game, sort of thing. Like, you can tell the difference between those kind of teams. I think last year's NRL Grand Final was a bit of this, where on paper, I don't know that the Canberra Raiders were any worse than the Sydney Roosters, but the Sydney Roosters, as defending champions, just, it's not that they were it's not that both teams weren't absolutely determined to win. I think it's that the Roosters, as a team who have won a few recent premierships and been a top tier team for a little while, I think they expected to win more than the Raiders, who were more desperate to win. And like, it's not that there was a massive difference during the game. It's not like there was a massive difference between the quality of the teams. It's just that little intangible. I don't know. And like, I read a book on, it was, what's it called? It's called The Jordan Rules. It was about Michael Jordan's, it was like a sort of fly on the wall thing about one of the seasons with Michael Jordan and the, Chicago Bulls in their first three-peat, I think it would have been. And the funny thing about that is there was like, at the start of the book, you get through, like, cause that was well before I was, aware of basketball. I was probably in a cradle at the time when they won their first title. So it's just always been a known thing for me. Like, I grew up with the Chicago, they're not really they haven't been at that stage for a while now, but when I first became aware of basketball, was like the Chicago Bulls with the team. They were that was the jersey you'd see around the most. Cause they had this culture of winning throughout the 90s. But the funny thing about that, I never really thought about it, is reading that book, like, that was not what they were known as, of course, before Michael Jordan came along. And even then, while Michael Jordan was there for 5, 6, 7 years before they won their first title with him, sort of thing. And like, he, at that point, had a bit of a reputation for being selfish. And it was like Phil Jackson came in, tried to bring in the triangle offense, tried to change things up. And this book was all about the pushback, because you didn't hear about it in public, because things were a little more protected back in those days between what makes it to the media and what doesn't. And that's why this book was kind of scandalous, because it was like, oh, here's Michael Jordan as this kind of like beloved all-American athlete guy, but here he is now in a more selfish kind of greedy perspective, which you don't see. Like, the public wouldn't have had that kind of spotlight on him in that way before, but like up until they won their first title and they went on to win 2 more immediately after, like that was a franchise that was kind of known for being that team that couldn't quite do it. And I think of like a team like the Cleveland Cavaliers and the same thing, when like the Cleveland as a city went like 50 years without a title until LeBron James led them to a championship recently. And if that's what it takes, like borderline the greatest basketballer of all time, I mean, those are probably the 2 guys, right? Jordan and LeBron. If that's what it takes to break that kind of narrative, I don't know what the Warriors are waiting for. You just got to find the greatest player of all time. Where's the Knicks? Like, well, I'm not going to name a name because that's going to start a whole other debate between people listening. But you know, it's I don't know how you quite break that narrative for a team like the Black Caps or the Warriors, other than just hoping you get lucky one season. I mean, the Black Caps got as close as you can possibly get without winning. So,
I mean, for the Warriors, you just try better at doing what the best teams are doing, and like for the Black Caps, you might want to focus on being a bit more ruthless and like just trying to focus on ruthlessly wanting to win. And I think there's so many different ways, because like we've talked about a family orientated culture with like City Kickboxing, but then I don't imagine the Michael Jordan culture was family orientated. So it's like there are different, not levels, but there are different ways of having a culture, and you just have to find the culture that suits your environment, your competition, and what you're trying to achieve. But other than being a Kiwi and, you know, you want to see your Kiwi folks winning, you either win or you don't. Like, that's sport, and that's what it is. So it's either you're doing absolutely everything you can to establish the desired culture and to break that hump, or you're not. And with various, like, either instance is complex, and either instance of the Warriors and the Black Caps involves so many different variables, but you're either ruthlessly pursuing that excellence or you're not. And it's just as simple as that. Like, yes, like obviously, again, there's so many variables at play and there's so many different ways of doing it, but the proof is in the pudding. You're either a champion or you're not. You're either consistently at the top or you're up and down. You're either there or thereabouts and can't quite get over the hump, or you get over the hump and you put everything in the past and you move forward with that new invigoration, that new confidence. Like, I think you can get a bit too sympathetic, but too empathy. You can't have too much empathy, but in this context, like, a little bit too much of empathy can come into the brain, and that's where you get into excuses. That's where you get into reasons why this might happen, that might happen. You get into like curses. You get into the gods were against us and those kind of ideas. But if it's happening over a consistent period of time, like, we're not just talking once that the Black Caps made it to a final and didn't win. We're not just talking one season in which the Warriors finished 10th. These are patterns that have occurred over a long period of time, and that when you have such trends that are present, that's when it's a case of you're either doing absolutely everything or you're not.
Yep, and sometimes, like, there's a legitimate philosophical argument to say that maybe you don't have to. Like, maybe there are other things that can be prioritized. I think Arsene Wenger is maybe the most famous of these kind of, I mean, he's the football professor, right? So of course he's a philosopher. He used to like, he's admitted this many times, like, he would prioritize the style of play that Arsenal would play under his leadership over, say, the opposite effect would be Jose Mourinho, who has no style of play, adapts himself to what the opposition are doing, and then ruthlessly goes after winning, and then has this reputation as a winner, therefore, which, by the way, recent years, not really justified at all. He's more of a guy who destroys clubs from the inside out at the moment, but let's not get into more personal disputes. Arsene Wenger would, like, and I think football's a bit more unique because often it's just like 90 minutes for a 1-0 win kind of thing. Like little margins can decide big differences in a game of football. And he always, like, his thing was that chasing results is too fleeting, like too temporary, too leaving it up to that kind of luck or fate or whatever and taking it out of your own hands. Whereas if we set up a team that can play in a certain way, we will ultimately, through the bigger picture, win more than just like focusing on the here and now, ruthlessly going after how we get these 3 points kind of thing. He's like, that won't set us up for the long term. That'll make us too inconsistent. But like, then what do you look at from there? Was a guy who was extremely consistent, finishing 4th place every year and getting knocked out in the Champions League knockouts, and not winning as much as he really should have with the many good Arsenal teams he had over those years, to be honest. Whereas Mourinho won a lot. So I don't know. There's certainly like, and I think even, I don't know. I wonder if this crosses over into the Ronaldo versus Messi debate as well, because you got two very different stylistic footballers there, and it seems to be a little bit of a aesthetical debate when people, like, when you ask someone which player they prefer, it often tells you a lot about their personality and what kind of things, when they're watching sport or even just general life things, what kind of things they prioritize. So yeah, I don't know, it's not simple, and maybe the Black Caps are the best they can be, just doing what they're doing and being unlucky and not getting over the final hurdle sometimes. Like, maybe that if they were more ruthless, they wouldn't be anywhere near as good. I don't know, but yeah, it's complicated, but it's the situation we find ourselves in, of course.
Well, everyone's individual, so everyone has different priorities, and that's simply what it is. Like, you just figure out what's important to you and base your objectives around that. Otherwise, we'll wrap it up there. Wildcard, we'll be back next Tuesday for another edition of the Nichecast, and we'll see what pops up on the agenda then. Otherwise, just do your thing. Just live your life and see what happens. Kia kaha, stay beautiful. Ciao.